I was born in Afton, Wyoming on March the 4th, 1935.
And I was born in Provo, Utah in July 26, 1935.
My father is Clarence Taylor. My mother is Viona Oletha Williamson, her maiden name, Taylor.
My mother's name was Leon Elizabeth Nielsen, and my dad was Milton Carlos Jones. The thing I remember the most about my parents were their faith. My dad, when he was a little boy, 6 years old, went to get a load of coal with his dad at Price Canyon somewhere, and on the way back, with a team of horses and a wagon, and on the way back there was a steep incline down, and his father said to him, "Milt, get off and check the wagon out. Tell me if there's anything wrong with anything on the wagon." So my dad, little 6 or 8 year old, jumps out and looks all around. He said, "Dad, I don't see anything wrong." And his dad said, "But you're not riding down." He says, "You walk down the canyon and I'll meet you at the bottom." And so his dad starts down, and all of a sudden, the steeper it got, the faster the horses went, and all of a sudden he tried to brake to help the horses hold back the weight of the coal, and the brake broke. And the team just couldn't hold it, and they just got going faster and faster. And so Grandpa Jones, my Grandpa Jones, knew that if he didn't jump, he would be killed along with the horses and the coal. And so he jumped, and he would have made it, except one of the reins whipped around one of his ankles and pulled his leg under the wheel. And it severed it. It was just hanging by some skin. And so he hollered to his son, my dad, told him to run for help. So my little 8 year old dad ran 6 miles to town and got his mother and his oldest sister. It was a stepsister who was training to be a nurse. And they came up, and when they got there, Grandpa Jones was leaned up against the side of the mountain and sitting there calm as can be, and the doctor went over and looked at his leg and said, "Brother Jones, there's no reason under heaven medically that I can explain why you did not bleed to death." And Grandpa Jones says, "Well, Doc, you don't know everything." He says, "I just prayed to Heavenly Father, and it didn't bleed a teaspoonful after that." And so they loaded him up. They came up in the doctor's car. The doctor did have a car. And they took him down to his home. And the nearest hospital was in Salt Lake, which was just out of the question to go that far for help. So the doctor and his oldest daughter, by his first marriage, was the nurse, and they started amputation on the leg without anesthesia or anything. They just the tools that he had in his case, and started sawing off the leg till they got to solid bone, and it cut it off just above the knee, just below the knee. And he had a stump leg the rest of his life, and the doctor didn't think he would make it through the night after they took his leg off, but he did. And he lived to be an old man in his 90s. I need to tell you why he had 2 wives. He married his first wife, and she died in childbirth with her 8th child. And so my grandma was 24-year-old, and she was a school teacher. And I don't know how it happened, but she became the caregiver of his younger children. And then he asked her to marry him. and she bore him 8 children also. So she was 24, and some of his oldest children, like Claire, that was the nurse, were almost as old as their second mom. So their faith probably describes my grandparents and my dad is about as good as I could describe that.
I had 5 siblings. There were 4 daughters and 1 brother. My oldest sister passed away a few months ago at the age of 96. And my youngest sister, who is Claire, 2.5 years younger than I am, is still living. So my only brother, his name was Merrill, was electrocuted on a high power line that he was helping to construct across the Mojave Desert in California. And on the last, they'd been pulling up grounds all day, and they had the last connection to make to finish the project. And they asked who wants to go up and make the connection. And Merrill said, I will. And so he climbed the tower, and the second that he touched the wire, he was electrocuted. Static electricity from a line that was running parallel to the line they were constructing had caused the electricity to be in the line.
He jumped.
As he
jumped the span.
As he made the last reach to touch the wire to make the last connection. And so that was how he was electrocuted.
He was a soldier in the war. Tell him about that.
Yes, he had run through some harrowing things during his younger years. My father was a sheep man, and one time when his little family was out on the range with him, and my father was out with the sheep, and mother was left in charge of the kids at camp, the sheep camp. My brother Merrill and his sister Rose, who was just older than him, the one that I just said had passed away at 96. We're out playing with something in an old cabin, and it was a dynamite cap went off and blew his thumb and his finger and part of the third finger off. And my mother left her little daughter Linnea, who was younger than Merrill, and Rose, the oldest one, to tend her while she caught a horse and took Merrill many miles down to where there's a railroad place at Sage. And there they were able to go into Kemmerer, Wyoming, where they, operated on his hand. So he grew up with missing most of the thumb and 2 of his fingers. And so when it came time for the Second World War, he wanted to be a pilot. But because of his hand, that was not possible. They wouldn't permit that. So during the Second World War, he was in charge of a grounding crew that prepared the airplanes while they were on the ground to go on their next mission, bombing mission over Germany. And so he was in charge of the ground crew of I believe it was a B-29 bomber, getting it ready for its next mission and load it. So that was his experience during the Second World War. And when he came home from the service, then he got married, and he also worked on these high power lines in Montana and then in California where he was killed.
And I'm the second oldest in my parents' family, and they had 10 children. 2 of them were full-term babies, but they died prior. They were born dead, but they were full-term babies. And so we named the little girl Susan, and we named the little boy Timothy. And they have a really special place in every one of our hearts, all my brothers and sisters. But Mom and Dad had Joanne, my oldest sister, and then me, and then they had 6 sons. Well, they had 5 sons, and then they had the 2 little babies. And the only way they saved their 6th son was they performed an autopsy on the little girl, because it was really strange that mothers should have all those babies and then 2 of them die with no apparent thing wrong with their little bodies. And so they performed an autopsy on the little girl and found out that she suffocated because the placenta pulled away from the navel, and she was without oxygen for a few hours before she was born. So that gave them a clue of what to do to save the next baby, and so they took him C-section about 2 weeks early. So that's how I got my 6th brother. So he's quite a bit younger than the rest of us. He was more like I don't know, I was probably, he was born the same year that I graduated from high school.
So there was 10, including the 2
babies
that died.
Yeah, Joanne and me, Patricia, and then Dick, Don, Dan, Steve, Sam, the 2 babies, and then Mike.
Oh, so the 2 babies that were born dead were after all?
After 5 of the boys, and then Mike was the very last.
That was Susan and Timothy that were still born?
Still born. Yeah.
Okay, and then Mike was born after them?
Yeah.
And how many of your siblings are still living?
All of us, all 8, are still living. Yeah. I'm 83 and my sister is 84, going on 85. Next March she'll be 85. And I'll be 83 in July.
26th of this month.
So.
How old was Merrill when he died?
Oh golly, I don't know.
2 children.
I would say that he was 25, 26, somewhere in there.
Oh, we had so much fun. I mean, my parents went through the Great Depression, and I was born just at the end of the Great Depression, so we made our own fun, and we had a blast. I had a really neat uncle that was probably, he was a teenager when we were kids, and he would come over and play with us, and we'd play hide and seek. And he would climb trees, and we couldn't find him because he was up in the trees. And we had lots of fun. We'd play Annie I Over, we'd play Run Sheepy Run, we'd play Kick the Can, we'd play that snow thing. We'd make a circle in the snow and have it divided into 3, and somebody would be it, and they'd have to catch you somewhere. You could run, the only safe place was in the middle. And we just made our own fun and had a great time, but we also worked. And you saved everything. You didn't waste anything. You saved the string off of a flour sack, and you used the flour sacks for dish towels, and you used the string to tie up a package if you had to mail it. You didn't tape it up, and you just didn't waste anything. And I can remember going up down the ditch bank looking for asparagus in the spring for us to eat. We even ate dandelion greens once, but I never learned to like them. And also we had we went up the river. There's a railroad track that went just at the edge of our field. We'd just walk across the field, and we'd follow the railroad tracks up with a little bucket and pick up all the little pieces of coal that fell off of the engine, and use that to put in our little coal stove. We had a coal stove in the front room, and that heated all the rest of the house except for the little wood range that Mom had in the kitchen. So the bedrooms were very cold, but you would put lots of blankets on. And my dad was a real hard worker. But he was always happy. You know, I never remember my mom and dad feeling like the world was coming to an end or that they had it too hard. My dad whistled while he worked, and he would milk the cows in the morning, go to work for Geneva Steel during the day, come home and milk the cows at night. And he also had you know, milked the cows after he came home, you know, milked them in the morning before he went to work.
One of the greatest blessings I've received from my parents was the faith that paying tithing brings into your lives. As I said earlier, my father was a sheep man. And during the Great Depression days, my father, just at the beginning of the Depression, had 500 ewes, mother sheep. But he felt like that his range that he run them on would take care of twice that many. And so I think my mother was a little bit hesitant to agree, but he said, I think that we should borrow enough money to buy another 500 ewes. Well, he started out with 500 ewes that were free of debt. And as soon as he borrowed enough money to buy 500 more, the Great Depression hit. And prices went down to where all 1,000 head of sheep wasn't worth a fraction of what he owed the bank because of the money that he had to borrow. But during those years following that, in the middle of this Great Depression, my father decided that it would be very important if he started paying his tithing. And so, as the story goes, one spring while they were docking the lambs means when you cut the tail off and castration, put a brand, a paint brand on their hide, and also maybe a mark in their ear. When he was doing that to the new crop of lambs, he told his brother Legrand that he wanted to take a certain number of the best lambs, the largest ones that he had, and put a different mark on them, which was actually the mark that his bishop would have. And so his brother says, well, why are you going to do that? And he says, I'm going to use those lambs when I sell them this fall to pay my tithing. Now at this time, Dad had 3 mortgages on his sheep. One was at Kemmer, Wyoming, the county seat of Lincoln County where we lived. One of them was at Montpelier, Idaho. And the third one, I don't know, was with one or the other of those banks that they had to send it out because the money that they owed was big enough they needed to do that. I don't know quite the circumstances of that. But anyway, there was those 3 mortgages. One at Kemmer, Wyoming, one at Montpelier, Idaho, and the other one with this other. And that fall, when he shipped his sheep, his lambs, he loaded them up on the cars, railroad cars, and headed east with them. And at Laramie, Wyoming, when he needed to decide whether to go south to Denver or go on to Omaha, Nebraska, he called into the commission yards at Denver, and they said, "Taylor, our advice is to sell your lambs as soon as you can because the market's been slipping and going down a little bit every day." And Father decided, no, I'm going to go on to Omaha, at least. At Omaha, as they unloaded the lambs and trying to decide whether to sell them then, he got the same message that Denver had told him. Sell your lambs as soon as you can because the market's been slipping a little bit every day. And my father said, no, I'm going to go on to Chicago. Well, Chicago was the end of the road. He couldn't go any farther than that. And when he got to Chicago, he had the same advice. Sell your lambs very soon because the market's been slipping a little bit. And Dad thought about it and he says, no, I'll sell them the day after tomorrow. And the day that my father sold his lambs, there was a spurt in the market, and he sold his lambs within just a few cents of the top of the entire market of the year. And the money that he received, he went back home, stopped at Kemmer, Wyoming, paid off that mortgage, went on to Montpelier, Idaho, and paid off that mortgage. And whichever one of those banks was handling that third mortgage, he also paid that off. And he told the last banker, he says, that's all of my money. Can I borrow $50 to get home on? Nobody could ever convince my father that he was smart enough to know the exact time that he should sell his lands. But the Lord did. The Lord knew that he was paying his tithing that year. When he got back home, he went to, I believe the bishop was Bishop Frank Gardner, and he says, did you receive a check for any lambs? He says, yes, I did, and I don't have any lambs. I was getting ready to send a check back to him. And Dad says, well, that's my tithing money. And so I've had that strong testimony of my father. Another strong testimony was an experience that my mother had with tithing. During these years that the bank owned everything, gave them just a little bit to live on, Mother told my father, she says, I feel like that if we were paying some tithing, we'd be better off. And so Dad told her, he says, well, if you can save anything out of that little bit of money that the bank gives us every month to live on, to pay tithing, he gave his permission. Well, she had a little milk cow, a little Jersey milk cow. And she went to the bishop. You know, in those days you could turn, you know, a few sacks of potatoes or a few in for tithing, etc. Well, she told the bishop, she says, "Bishop, I want to turn this Jersey milk cow in for tithing." And the bishop says, "Sister Taylor, you have a large family. My mother was raising several of her younger siblings because her mother had passed away during the end of the First World War, during the flu epidemic. And so she had several of her siblings that my father and mother were raising, as well as her own children." And the bishop said, "Do you realize how much that cow provides for your family? You got your milk, your butter that you churn the cream for, and the cheese that you make." He says, "I'll tell you what." He says, "Let's put a value of $75 on that milk cow. And during the coming year, you can gradually pay that off and redeem that cow." Why they use that word to redeem the cow, I don't know. But anyway, at the end of the year, my mother was a worried woman. She hadn't been able to redeem that cow and pay back to the bishop the $75 value that they put on it. And she got down on her knees and she pleaded with her Father in heaven that if he would help her redeem that cow, that she would do better from then on, and taking the tithing out first and paying the tithing whenever they got a little bit from doing ironing or what the bank had sent them to live on. And as she got through with that prayer, there was a knock on the door. And she opened the door, and there stood her cousin, Albert Rutherford, who was also a sheep herder. And he looked at my mother and he said, "Viona," that's my mother's name. He says, "I don't know why I'm here, but do you need $75? Not $70, not $80. Do you need $75? The exact amount that my mother needed to redeem that milk cow." So I've had those both miraculous experiences of my father and my mother that have always been a testimony to me of the blessings of paying and honest tithing. During our own lives, Patricia and I have strived to be very regular and diligent with the payment of our tithing. But I want my grandchildren to know that the blessings that the Father in heaven has promised from the payment of tithing are very great. The first job I got paid for, I believe, was thinning apples in an apple orchard when I was, probably 15 years old.
And go ahead.
And earlier than that, I did help when I was quite young with haying, and when I was helping a neighbor, I would drive the team of horses while the wagon was being loaded with the hay coming onto it. And as I recall, I think I did earn something from that, but I don't remember.
And what does thinning apples mean?
Well, when on the limb, if you got 3 or 4 apples right close together, you want to pick them all off and just leave one at that
If there's
spot.
doubles, 2
So if there's
Yeah.
two together,
Flip one off.
you get rid of one of them, and try to have the apples on the tree a few inches apart on the branches.
I also thinned apples one year, but my first paying job was babysitting. I used to get babysitting, and I think when I was even younger than that, I hoed thinned beets. You'd get paid either a dime or a quarter for each row. You would go down and make the beets 6 inches apart. The hoe, you'd cut out all the others and make sure you didn't leave two together. So I'd work all day. Mom and Dad would take me there. Probably didn't earn enough to pay for their gas to take me there, and then they'd come and get me at night. And so, yeah, that was my first job. But my first paying job, besides just these little, babysitting things, was I got a job at the bank. Worked in a bank for, I think, 4 years before I married him. Oh, I liked grade school. I enjoyed my schooling years. I never had real problems. I especially loved my second grade teacher. She taught us things besides just schoolwork, and I learned to read really easy. I don't know how the children learn to read now, but we'd have to read this book, Run Dick, Run Jane, Run, 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 and over again. And I don't remember having to learn all the different things, how to use vowels and that. I just remember I could always read it and I could always pronounce it out. I don't know all the technologies, but it just was easy for me. And my second grade teacher taught me other things besides that about helping at home. She said, don't think about, I gotta do the dishes again. She says, my mother used to teach me and have me dry the glasses. She says, look at that, that's so shiny and pretty. There's not even a spot on those glasses. And she made me think that washing dishes was just a real joy because you could make them look so pretty. But I learned to like her a lot. She's one teacher I remember. And my sixth grade teacher was, in the summer he led tours through Timpanogos Cave. And every year for that, just before school would end, that whole grade school would go and hike up Timpanogos and go through the Timpanogos Cave. And so I got to go through Timpanogos Cave, I don't know how many years. So yeah, I enjoyed school, but I was never what you would call popular. I was the poor girl on the block, and I had one special friend that always treated me good. I worked for the bank 2 years, and then I thought, well, maybe I ought to go to college. So I had earned enough money to pay my way. And so I went to college for 1 semester and got so homesick I came back and got my job back at the bank. And so I have 1 semester of college.
Where was that at?
BYU.
My early school years, I remember that one teacher would teach about 4 grades at Osmond in Wyoming, in Star Valley, Wyoming. And I did okay at school. I had one friend, Ted Halstead, that was very brilliant, and he got pushed ahead, a full grade ahead of the rest of us. But I always had an interest. During the war, I had I think, vivid imagination, because I always dream about what I would do to Hitler, or what I would do to Tojo in Japan, if I had a chance, I guess. And think about things like that. But during high school, I had a very close friend that I was able to teach the gospel to. His name was Lonnie Davis. And I had the privilege of baptizing this very, very close friend during our high school days. I had always had quite an interest in German, because there was a German exchange student in high school one year, and since my grandmother was born in Switzerland and spoke German, it was her native language, I'd always had quite an interest in learning German. And so I went, before my mission, I went to BYU for the headquarters back then instead of semesters. And I went for 3 quarters 1 year. I was on the judging team for our agricultural classes, and judged cattle in Denver and various places that they took us to. I also had a real interest in everything agricultural, and I went to BYU for 3 quarters the first year, and then 2 quarters the next year. And during that third time, when I would have been in the 3rd quarter, I was called on a mission. And I was the first missionary to leave the Dillon Ward in Dillon, Montana. And I was called to the East Central States Mission. My first companion was a married man. He had a beautiful wife, 2 little children that he had left home to go on a mission. So he was really a dedicated young man, and he was an outstanding missionary. He became assistant to the president during the time that he was on his mission. But he asked me if I had a girl back home that I was interested in. Now, we kind of skipped over a few things here. The very first date I ever went on, Patricia Jones, this lady right here, asked me to go, I forget what they called it, a Sadie Hawkins
It was
type
Sadie
dance.
Hawkins Day dance, and it was a girl ask boy thing. So I asked him.
So she asked me to go, and I went with her. And I only dated her a couple of other times besides that date that she asked me to go on.
The only reason he asked me on the 2nd date is because his mother told him it was only polite if you got asked on a date to return them. So.
Don't believe her. That wasn't entirely true. It's because I was a gentleman.
Yeah, not because you wanted to.
Oh, I did. Well, it wouldn't have turned out the way it did eventually. But anyway, this elder Barnes asked me, is there anybody back home that you like? And I says, well, not really, but there's one girl that I should have paid more attention to. And so he asked me some questions about her, and he finally says, well, why don't you write her a letter and tell her where you're at? And so I thought about that, and wrote to Patricia that I was on a mission and where I was at in Logan, West Virginia. East Central States back in those days included almost all of West Virginia, most of Kentucky, and most of Tennessee, which now has a lot of missions in that same area. So I did. I wrote her a letter. And it was quite a while before I got a return or an answer. And I think that her father is to blame.
Yeah, he was. I got his, well, my mom called me at the bank, and that was a no-no. You never call people at work. And I got this phone call, and she says, Patsy, when you get home, there's a letter waiting for you. And I says, who was it from? She says, well, you'll just have to see when you get home. And so when I got home, there was his letter, and I was going to write him back that very night, and I was busy in there writing it, and my dad came in and he says, if I were you, I wouldn't be quite so quick in answering that letter if I were you. So I finished writing it, but then I didn't mail it for 2 weeks. Anyway.
So I received the letter, and we wrote back and forth and exchanged pictures. She sent me a beautiful picture of her, and I sent her the picture that I had taken when I went on my mission. And eventually I asked her if she would wait for me until I came home, and she agreed to do so. And the rest is history. We were married. I got home in April, and we were married in
June.
What, it's 19th of June?
Yeah.
19th of June.
Yeah.
What year?
1957.
Yeah, and before he asked me to marry him, though, you didn't, go on a trip without a chaperone if you're not married. So he came down to see me and invited me to go with him on this trip down to Utah and Wyoming and back up to Montana, to where his parents had a ranch. So his mother rode with us, and he took me to Utah, and I met his sister, one of his sisters down there.
Dora Mae.
And then he took me to Wyoming, where I met his older sister Rose and Linnea. And after I'd been
and in Utah, we stopped and saw Logan, my sister Dora Mae Martindale.
Yeah.
And her.
And after I'd met all of his sisters, and I guess he asked if I was good enough or whatever. Anyway, got there okay, I guess. And so then always at Rose's place, we went out for the night, and he asked me to wait for him. Or not wait for him, but to marry him. And so then...
I thought that was on the grounds of the Logan Temple.
No. I thought you would ask me that night when you took me on the grounds, but you didn't ask me until we went and met Rose. And that night I remember I came back in the house and wrote my folks a letter and told them, and I mailed it from Wyoming after I'd met Rose. And told them that you'd asked me to, you didn't phone call anybody then. It cost money to make a phone call. So, yeah, so I wrote my folks a letter, told them they'd asked me to marry him. And did they come up and take me back home from Montana?
Your folks?
That? Yeah.
I don't remember.
I think they did.
But I do know that after we were married, we were working on my dad's ranch, putting up hay, and Patty and my mother did the cooking for the hay crew, which would include, I think, probably 7 or 8 men.
Yeah, and we'd get up early in the morning. I thought, I'll never be able to do what his mom does. She never measured anything. We'd just get breakfast over with, and she'd start making 10 pies, and she wouldn't measure it. She'd just throw hands full of flour in and the shortening and mix it up somehow, and by noon we had 10 beautiful pies for dessert as well as all the other stuff to go.
And they were good pies. Oh, they were as good a crust as you could ask on a pie.
She really fed them good. And I thought, wow, I'll never be able to do this, but I was a good help to her, and then he got drafted, and so we started out on our own after that. So.
I was drafted into the service and did my basic training at Fort Carson, Colorado, which is close to Colorado Springs. And that was in the middle of the winter, and it was not a very good experience. For instance, when I went through the infiltration course where you're dragging forward and they're shooting, firing, you know, over your head, and you're down low, dragging yourself along. It was so muddy. And my rifle that I was dragging, and my helmet got so big that it was just a big ball of sticky mud, about 3 times the size of what a helmet ought to be. And my rifle was about that big around of solid mud, 6 or 7 inches of mud through it. And I'd drag that along and stop occasionally and try to dig some of the mud off. It was one of the worst experiences I've ever had, going through that infiltration course. And from there, I was assigned for my Signal Corps training in Augusta, Georgia. And that is where our first son, Craig, was born, right at the end of my Signal Corps training there. And after he was born, and we were assigned to Fort Meade, Maryland, and the first thing that happened to me when you just generally don't volunteer for something, but I did. They asked for two volunteers of the people standing out there in line as we came into that camp. And I volunteered, and this other fellow volunteered, and it just so happened that both of our names was Taylor. I was PFC Ralph Taylor, and he was a red-headed fellow, and we were platoon clerks for the rest of the time that we were in the service, along with our other, duties. But it got us out of a lot of KP, which was good.
I got to tell you, but an experience that happened when he was transferred up to Maryland, and they have storms that come in really fast. It can be sun shining, and all of a sudden the storm will come in, and within minutes it'll pour down rain, and so this happened this one time, and the wind started blowing, just really kind of scared me. So I went around, and it gets really hot. I mean, 90 degrees, and it's really hot. So I had all the windows open, and I went and hurried and shut them, and it just started blowing so bad that I was afraid something bad would happen. So I took little Craig and curled up in the bed with my body surrounding him in case something happened, I could protect him. And while I was laying there, you could just hear the wind blowing, and I thought it would just shake the house, blow the roof off or something. And all of a sudden, the whole house did shake. The bed shook with me and little Craig in there, and then all of a sudden, it was gone. And when I dared get off the bed, I looked out the window, and there was trees laying down, roots pulled up. There was 4 trees right in front of our great big tall trees. We were in the 2nd story upstairs apartment, and there was 4 trees. 3 of them were right in front of the house, and they were still standing, but the one right where our bedroom was, where I was laying with little Milton, or little Craig, there was this tree uprooted, laid down right beside the house, and I'm sure that's what shook the apartment while we were there. And then he doesn't come home, and he doesn't come home, and I'm thinking, whoa, where is my husband? Is he somewhere dead with the tree falling over him? And he came home about an hour, 2 hours late, and there were trees all across the roads everywhere. He had to make detours, and it took him a long time to get home. So.
While we were at Fort Meade, Maryland, our whole battalion was sent on a maneuver across the United States. So we went in convoy, and the equipment that I was trained to have, we called it an Angry 26. It was a big 2.5-ton truck with its communication cab on the back, in which you would could send out signal, training, and then it pulled a power unit, which was about 1.5 tons behind it, and so we were going on this convoy across the United States, and we had several times that we broke down, and they had to repair, and it took us quite a lot of days to get from Maryland to Tacoma, Washington. When I was stationed at Fulton, Kentucky, every week we would go to Hickman, Kentucky, and have a cottage meeting in a home, where people would be invited in, and we'd preach to them, Elder Rollins and I. And these old Kentuckians, they would be chewing their tobacco and spitting in the spittoons while we was preaching to them. And they could be sitting on this side of the room, one of them, the platoon be sitting over there, and he'd put his fingers up to his mouth and spit in it and hit that platoon. So these things would be singing across in front of you while you was preaching the gospel. But at that particular place, I was able to baptize a young lady. And then I was transferred, I think, to Bowling Green, Kentucky. And this is a kind of an interesting story, and Patty is part of it. I wondered about this young lady that I had baptized. What happened after we baptized her? Because there wasn't anybody else in Hickman, Kentucky at the time that was members of the church. In Fulton, we rented the Seventh-day Adventist chapel so that we would meet on Sundays in it. But years later, just in fact, probably less than 10 years ago or thereabouts somewhere, Patty and I took a trip back east. And I worked at Micron Technology at Boise at the time. And one lady there had told us about this place in North Carolina called Boone, North Carolina, and how good this one restaurant was at this Boone, North Carolina. So I took Patty to Logan, West Virginia, where I wrote her the first letter and showed her some of the sights of Virginia. And then we drove down to North Carolina and went all the way to Boone to eat dinner at Daniel Boone restaurant there. And it was a good meal, wasn't
It
it?
was very good. It was worth going there for.
So, anyway, then we went from there to Fulton, Kentucky. And when we went to Fulton, then they had a ward at Fulton and a nice chapel. And we pulled into Fulton not knowing where the LDS chapel would be. And we stopped at I think it was a parts store, and asked them if they knew where the Mormon church was, and they didn't have any idea. But we looked it up in their phone book and called the church, and the man answered, and he started to give us directions on how to get to the church, and it was a little bit confusing. So he says, "Just wait." He says, "I'll come and get you." And so when he came and got me, I rode with him, and
I followed him in
Patty
the car.
followed him with our car. And while I was visiting with this man, I asked him some questions about his, was he a convert, and etc. And he told me, yes. And come to find out, he was baptized in Hickman, Kentucky, and he married. When he came home from the service, and that his wife was the same lady that I had been wondering about, that I had baptized many, many years ago. And I said, "Well, where were you when we were teaching your wife?" He says, "Well, I was in the service, and I came home, and he says, my wife told me," he says, "you need to listen to these Mormon missionaries." And he says, "Oh, okay." And he says, "I didn't know what a Mormon missionary was." And he said, I listened to him, and they teach me on these little flannel boards, and everything made sense. And he says, I believed. And so one day they says, "We're getting transferred. Do you want to get baptized first?" And he said, "Yes." And so he got baptized in the Mississippi River under the lights of a ferry before they was transferred out. And then later they came, and some missionaries came and got he and his wife and took him to some conference that was at Paducah, Kentucky. And there he received the priesthood and was blessed. And then they sent him back to organize a little group there. And so he had the authority to do that. And he says, "I didn't know what I was doing." He says, "I had the boys and the girls pass the sacrament." Anyway, this man later was one of the bishops of the Fulton Ward. And his wife had passed away a couple of years before I met him. So
That's really neat.
it's kind of interesting how things happen and you find out the fruits of your labors. And somebody you thought, well, they couldn't possibly have stayed active in the church. There wasn't anything there to support them. But she did, and her husband became a bishop in the Fulton Ward.